You're now live.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And yes, I now resume the hearing. Yeah, first of all, my apologies to everyone for telling you to do precisely the wrong thing, which was to stay in the previous meeting rather than come out of it, which is what in the event we were supposed to do. So that was my fault entirely. I do apologise, but hopefully everyone has now found their way to the right place. So I'm going to simply pick up where I left off. I think the hands are in the same order. Apologies if not, but that ought to not make any difference. So at the top of my list, I have Mr. Williams for Bloor Homes. So Mr. Williams.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. So for those that don't know, I represent Bloor Homes and the Crown Estate, and you will have received evidence from Mr. Dixon and Mr. White, and appended to Mr. Dixon's evidence, you have a detailed analysis which is directly relevant to the topic we're discussing now. So we have what I hope will be helpful, valuable information to provide to you. I should also say, by way of introduction, that the approach taken by the authority in relation to OAN in North Herts, we broadly agree is generally sound, and Mr. Baker has explained that position by reference to an in-depth analysis. However, we have gone further in a way that we believe the Council should have done, having regard to the whole of the advice given by PPG, which I think is, was the origin of your request to have regard to the new household projections, sir. And that's the part of the PPG that says should take into account the latest available information. Local needs assessments should be informed by the latest available information. And our particular focus has been on the question of affordability, which has already taken a little time at this examination. The short point really, sir, is this, by way of introduction, is that if the assessment is to be done by reference to the new household projections, it must be done with proper regard to the latest available information on affordability. That's not simply to accord with the PPG for the sake of it. It's also to follow logic and accord with good planning sense. Indeed, our position is it's the only appropriate thing to do in the current circumstances. I'm going to hand over, if I may, to Mr. Dixon, but in very short terms, sir, you will have read from the evidence we've submitted that the affordability ratio has increased significantly since 2013 by about 27%. And what the local authorities consultants have done is carried over that 10% figure without, we say, proper review and proper update. When that proper review is undertaken, one can appreciate the continuing trend and worsening of the affordability, in particular in relation to North Herts. And I emphasize the words in particular in relation to North Herts. And that situation is made the worse when we understand and appreciate the context of a supply, a historic supply of not meeting identified needs. So I don't now want to get bogged down in the detail myself. The broad figures that you will be told about do directly relate to your question about meaningful change. And Mr. Dixon will now explain it further and the approach that you ought to be taking to this question. And he has Mr. Baker to hand should you require any further more specialist evidence on the matter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. So as Craig's just explained, we don't take issue with the approach adopted by ORS in general, but rather instead we support our colleagues at the HBF in what they have said in relation to the uplift for market signals. So do you still have ED 171 and table 4 in that document to hand?
I believe I do, yes. Is that the table that I was looking at that shows the various factors such as house prices, rents, affordability, etc.?
It is, so yes. I conveniently managed to print myself a copy off over lunchtime, but if you have a copy of that to hand. Our case, sir, is that it's a combination of factors that need to be taken into account, as Mr. Lear suggested, but in particular, the relationship to the national picture, the worsening of affordability, and the high affordability ratios that exist. And it's a combination of those three that cause us to reach the conclusion that we do, that 10% is no longer a sufficient uplift. And we can all pick and choose from the very many numbers in that table, sir, but if I can just point out some generalizations as we see them. Firstly, if one looks at Aylesbury Vale, and it being a complicated table, I'll just allow you to find that. And in particular, there the relative to England row for Aylesbury Vale, you'll see that it's plus 25%, which is very similar to the North Herts position.
In terms of affordability?
In terms of affordability back in time. But that position hasn't changed as much as it has in North Herts, in Aylesbury Vale, and it's only increased the affordability ratio to 11.5. So it hasn't increased as much, and we've arrived at an affordability ratio that's lower. And yet the local plan there, the OAN there, includes a 17% uplift. If we then look at Cambridge, we'll see that the change of plus 27% is similar to the change in North Hertfordshire. And whilst it's resulted in an overall higher affordability ratio, we've clearly got a much higher market signals uplift of 30% having been endorsed.
Sorry, how many?
30% in Cambridge, sir. If we then look at East Hertfordshire, we have only a 16% change as opposed to a 29% 10-year change in North Hertfordshire. So it's not getting as bad as fast. And there we have a 14% uplift. In fact, we have to look to somewhere like South Cambridgeshire, where the 10-year change is only 12%, as opposed to a 29% in North Hertfordshire, and where the affordability ratio has only got to 10.5, as opposed to 12.3, to find somewhere where a 10% uplift has been endorsed. Now, as I said, we can all pick and choose from those figures, but some of those figures at least suggest that sticking with a 10% uplift is not the appropriate way to proceed. In fact, sir, if you look at the North Herts column, you'll see that relative to England, as the PPG suggests that we look, the position in North Hertfordshire was plus 29%, but has worsened to plus 68%. So, in summary, it's not an exact science, but if we look at the direction of travel, the situation in North Hertfordshire is worsening when compared to the national picture. And we don't believe that this justifies the continued application of a 10% uplift. Now, so we've set out in our statement, and you've got that before you, that we think that you should apply a 27% worsening of the affordability ratio to that 10% uplift that was previously proposed. There are other ways of doing it. If one were to use the latest guidance from the government enshrined in the standard method, then you get to a lot higher uplift. But we haven't used that, so we've stuck with the approach set out in our statement, which is that we think the 10% should be increased slightly to take into account those factors I've just outlined. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would help me, Mr. Lee, to hear your views on what we've just heard from Mr. Williams and from Mr. Dixon.
Yes. I think that evidently we are looking at a large amount of data, and Mr. Dixon has focused in on one particular market signal, the affordability market signal. And in some ways it's helpful to look at one number when you've got so many numbers, because you can sort of look at how that's changing. But evidently we have to take a view based upon all of the information that we have in front of us. Now, earlier on, I talked about the fact that previously the original SHMA included a 10% response to market signals, which encapsulated suppressed household formation as part of it. Now, in the original study for Stevenage and North Hertfordshire, that uplift was 317 dwellings out of a total uplift of 1,971. So it equated to 16%. Now, insofar as that number is no longer included, we have already got an uplift that is larger than we would have had otherwise. It's 19% higher. And evidently, that's not the 27% that is being suggested, but it represents that there is a higher uplift being applied now than when we had encapsulated the suppressed household formation within it. I think more generally, taking a step back, PPG recognises that the market signals is a response bear with me. It's a response to supply relative to demand, which is exactly the same rationale. The past under delivery of housing is one of those factors that market signals are seeking to address, which is one of the factors that's also listed under paragraph 15 as to the reason why we may see suppressed household formation. So these are interrelated factors. And whilst we have applied them as two discrete steps, I think it's important to recognise that whilst we have a 10% uplift for market signals, the combined uplift for market signals and suppressed household formation is 29%. And the proposed OAN of 11,445 dwellings is 32% higher than the starting point in terms of the households. So we have...
My apologies, if I could just ask you to pause there for a moment. I just wonder if they are interrelated. You say they're interrelated factors. I noticed that the 10% uplift is applied after the adjustments made for suppressed household formation.
Yes.
Is that a problem, or is that right?
I think that in the context of it being of the way in which it's set out within the PPG, it isn't a problem. We are looking at the extent to which the household projections as a starting point should be adjusted. And that is to take account of market signals and to take account of suppressed household formation. The original study, we applied a single uplift of 10%, which incorporated the adjustment for suppressed household formation. This time, because the scale of suppressed household formation is that much greater, because of the changes to the methodology, we have undertaken that as a separate stage, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we are looking at the way in which the household projection starting point should be adjusted. Now, we're consistently or continuing to apply the 10% uplift, and we recognise that the affordability indicators have deteriorated. Now, I would suggest that in the context of the original MPPF, the objectively assessed housing need had to be assessed for the housing market area. And insofar as we are looking at market signals, it is for the housing market area that we should be considering those signals. And whilst Aylesbury Vale has increased from 25% above to 58% above the national average, which is less than the increase in North Hertfordshire, when we consider Stevenage and North Hertfordshire as a housing market area, the increase was from 22% to 59%, so much closer to the Aylesbury Vale figures. Now, obviously, in Aylesbury Vale, the 17% uplift was applied to the old household formation numbers, so it incorporated suppressed household formation, albeit that the figures that we had there sort of predated the 2018 numbers. So there is an element here whereby it is a judgment. We're not seeking to be overly precise, and I think to go and say, well, we should take the 10% and increase it by 27%, so we have a 12.7% adjustment, risks us getting into the realms of taking a number to be more precise than it really is. It's a judgment number, and we consider that the judgment of 10%, in addition to the adjustment for suppressed household formation, is an appropriate adjustment, insofar as in taking those numbers together, we have an uplift of nearly 30%, which obviously is higher than the 20% that Mr. Berrant referred to in Runnymede. So we are in a position whereby we are looking at the various different factors. I don't see that there is a problem in the way in which they are addressed sequentially here, whereas they were addressed as a single step in the previous study. But I think that the further uplift of 2.7%, it yields a higher number, but the number it's adding on fewer than 300 additional dwellings over the plan period, so 15 dwellings each year. It's something whereby I think that in the round, the number that we have is an appropriate response in the context of the data.
Okay, thank you. Just while you're in the spotlight, Mr. Lee, do you want to reply to the other points that we heard before we broke for lunch, where we heard from Mr. Berrant, Ms. Sananda, and Mr. Norgan?
I mean, in terms of the points raised by Mr. Berrant, I think they reflect those that were raised by Mr. Howell-Williams and Mr. Dixon, in that essentially it was advocating a higher response to market signals. And whilst we accept that when considered holistically, both suppressed household formation and the further response to market signals is higher than the original 10%, quite markedly higher than the 10%. We believe that the 10% remains appropriate in the context of having already made a substantial adjustment for suppressed household formation, and to increase it yet further would be introducing double counting. With regard to the points that Mr. Norgan raised, essentially this is going back to what we previously talked about with regard to population and migration and the household projections, rather than the adjustment for market signals. But evidently the PPG is quite clear that the adjustment for market signals is an upward adjustment. There isn't the scope within the PPG to be providing fewer homes than needed to accommodate household growth. In terms of the objectively assessed need, establishing the housing need based upon the household projections is the floor, as it were, to the objectively assessed need, albeit that you may have a lower number once you start looking at constraints when considering the housing requirement. And then with regard to the points raised, forgive me, can you remind me of the other point that was raised there?
Yeah, well, Mr. Norgan did talk about affordability, and made the point that it's not just about market value of a property. It's about, well, he was talking about the size of the deposit needed, but I think that's really about other factors that, or at least other financial factors that affect access to the market, in effect.
Indeed, and I have some sympathy for Mr. Norgan's points that he's raised. However, the government position set out in planning practice guidance is that the more significant the affordability constraints, the larger the additional supply response should be. So yes, clearly, in terms of the practicalities of accessing mortgage and the need for deposits being significant, that is evidently a relevant point. But within the context of establishing the objectively assessed need, we are guided by the PPG, and evidently that is set out in terms of where the affordability constraints are identified, then it is an uplift in supply. And we have to bear in mind that uplift in supply will include a proportion of affordable housing as well as market housing. So it's not all going to be accessed with mortgage or dependent on mortgages. And even within the market housing, some of that may well be rented market housing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dorman.
Thank you.
You're muted, Mr. Dorman.
Yes, sorry. Have you got me now?
Have you now?
Fine, thank you. Yeah. As Mr. Lee has just said, it's patently obvious that all the market signals we have to abide by are geared to increasing the supply of housing. You know, I guess there's not much that we can do about that, despite the fact that, as Mr. Norgan says, the negative signals are increasingly apparent. In my written response, I gave a whole list of what I call negative market signals. But there's another one that has come to light, which I think is relevant here, is that the latest statistics from the Financial Conduct Authority shows that the value of new mortgage commitments in the second quarter of this year was 53.2% down than a year earlier, and the lowest level since the first quarter of 2010. So less houses will be bought by first-time buyers, it seems very apparent to me. So whilst the affordability statement made by North Herts is broadly true, I find it difficult to understand why applying a 10% market signals uplift, and frankly a 20% uplift, will in any way make any difference to house prices in North Herts being more than 10% or 10 times income. The idea that building, say, 1,000 more houses in the district will lead to house price drops, I think, is basic economic and supply hyperbole, when it's developers who control the supply and then ration it to ensure they get the highest prices and fight hard to ensure that bigger houses are included in developments on which they make most profit. Now, there are any number of commentators that I have found online that talk about this sort of thing, but I found three things that I'd like to share with you, which I was struck by. Firstly, contribution from Central Beds Council to the government's white paper on housing and planning. They said, and I quote, "We consider that getting more houses built more quickly would not have much impact in addressing the issue of developers not building out sites. Housing delivery is largely outside of the control of the planning system. CBC would propose that sanctions for developers should be introduced if they do not meet targets, in the same way as local authorities will be sanctioned for not producing plans in a timely manner. Developers would be required to commit to build-out rates at the plan-making stage, and if they don't stick to these, they are sanctioned with an increased or an additional one-off levy payment, a CSR blacklist, reputational approach, or even the deletion of their allocation and replacement with another, so that we can look at other schemes that will come forward." I also noted the comments of the Planning Officers Society in their response to the white paper, which said, "In the last decade, local planning authorities have permitted over 2.5 million homes, yet the house building industry has only just delivered 1.5 million homes. We are of the view that this data demonstrates that land supply is not a barrier to delivering homes, including in areas such as London and the South East. The core issue is that it is house builders who determine whether to build or not. In 2019, a record year, we granted consent for 371,000 homes, yet developers still only delivered 241,000. And finally, the report in July 2020 of the Select Committee on Communities and Local Government, and this was into social housing, but it had an interesting statistic, I thought. They said the construction industry has been hit hard by the COVID-19 lockdown. Output dropped 40% in April. Job vacancies were estimated in June to be down 54% on the quarter. As we previously described in this report, private house building follows a boom and bust cycle. We're at the beginning of a bust, which will likely lead to a drop in house building and a subsequent drop in demand for construction labour. Savills published a report on house building and the pandemic in June. And while admitting the future was uncertain, it made the following conservative projections. Firstly, at best 218,000 fewer homes will be built over the next 5 years compared to current net addition trends. The worst case scenario would result in 318,000 fewer homes. And secondly, the construction industry will lose an estimated 116,000 jobs, with 128,000 jobs lost in the wider supply chain. So on two counts, I think just building more homes for the sake of building more homes, I don't think is going to reduce the affordability. And secondly, it's doubtful whether those homes can ever be built given the state that the construction industry seems to be in, as evidenced by that Select Committee's report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dorman. Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you, sir. Because I don't need to add very much to what Mr. Dornan has just said, because I do agree with him I've been representing a number of people around the county in public hearings of this sort, various examinations. At the moment, I'm representing the North Midlands Green District Greenbelt Society at the one in Hatfield local plan examination, and we're dealing with similar problems there. Affordability ratio, I guess, is round about the same in Welwyn Hatfield. What we did was to commission a report from a housing expert, Alan Wenban Smith, who commented on the very issue that we're looking at now. And he pointed out that the bulk of the market in housing is already there. But 90% of it is housing which already exists. And as Mr. Lee has pointed out earlier, the people that who are affected most by this affordability problem are people in the younger age groups. And he's pointed that out very clearly earlier on. So these are the people who want to enter the market. These are the people who are most affected by the poor affordability ratio. But the bulk of housing that's being provided is for people who are already in the housing market, who already own houses and want to go up the market to improve their position. And that's the way in which the market works in this particular part of England, particularly. So I think that we need to have regard to that. And yes, we have to abide with what PPG is telling us, which is a highly political document. But nevertheless, we have to have regard to that. But I think certainly that the 10% uplift is even then too high. I think it really doesn't apply to the market as it really is. And I'd just like to endorse the point that was made by Ms. Sonnender earlier on about the element of double counting in here. If we look at the end of the Appendix 1 in the ORS report, that's 191B. Now, if we look at the end of that report and the appendix there, certainly those paragraphs are startling. Right at the end, in paragraph 41, they actually do admit that say taking account of the latest demographic trends from the ONS-based projections, a follow AN for housing would be 11,500 dwellings over the 20-year period. And they actually say there that would raise the scenario by 80% higher than the principal ONS projection, and 33% higher than the council's own preferred scenario. So I think those are quite staggering statistics in there, and I think you really do have to have regard to them. That's my point. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Goodall.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and avoid repetition of previous points. And you have in writing from us that we have got reservations regarding the starting point in terms of the most recent projections because of the strong link between rates of house building and rates of migration. And also in terms of suppressed household formation, we find that the most recent household projections indicate significantly higher growth in, for example, other households aged under 75 than the allowance made for by ORS. But notwithstanding that, in terms of what we've been asked to look at here, which is effectively importing the 2018 projections into the NPPF 2012 regime, we'd agree with the submissions of Mr. Brehan initially that really market signals are the adjustment that should be looked at to make sure that what we're achieving is a full objective assessment of housing need in the context of potentially using those projections. And it was picked up before lunch that it can only be one of those indicators that may indicate a worsening of the situation and a change in those indicators. And it was also picked up that you typically see most of those market signals increase. But actually, sir, the reference I would take you to, and I'm afraid, again, it's in the Council's ED 171 ORS appendix, the table that summarises market indicators. If you've been able to turn that up, sir, or when you're able to, I'm only going to look at the rate of development indicator.
I have that in front of me now, Mr. Goodall.
Thank you, sir. So what you will notice, and this I think is why caution needs to be expressed in terms of the differences between the official projections, and it's why we would say that this indicator is particularly significant in North Hertfordshire, is in the 2001 to 2011 average, rates of house building were running slightly above the average for England. But what you'll see in the top three rows is rates of house building to 2018, contrary to most of the comparator areas, began running significant or below the average for England. And actually the 7-year change, which is what will be reflected and what is reflected in the most recent projections, is a 40% decrease for North Hertfordshire. Just for your note, sir, the most recent constraints to house building in the area will be a worsening of that trend. So the most recent 3 years, for 2017 to 2020, we're now looking at average completions of only 273 in North Hertfordshire. The previous 5-year average was 330 dwellings per annum. So actually the information reflected in that indicator for those rows will now be outdated. That indicator has worsened since, in our representations, we recommended a market signals adjustment of 25%. The other reference, I think, again, just with reference to market signals and ensuring a full OAN when seeking to use the 2018 based projections, it's my final reference, sir, but it's paragraph 42 of the ORS appendix in ED 191A. I won't read it all out, sir, but effectively it says that the affordable housing, which has been mentioned several times, as a proportion of OAN, were the figure of 11,500 to be adopted, is likely to have increased. But in terms of assessing the full objectively assessed need, it's clear from paragraph 42 that the likely increase of affordable housing needs as a percentage of the potentially reduced OAN hasn't yet been assessed as part of this work. And that essentially brings you, I'm not going to repeat all the points, but it brings you into that wider bracket again of market signals into a 019 of the PPG, particularly in terms of affordability and overcrowding. Just in terms of the significance of that paragraph, given where we are in the plan period, although I don't understand the council to have done this work, against its own proposed policy requirement, we make it to be roughly a 1,250 unit affordable housing shortfall since 2011. So in the context of worsening market signals, we already have a significant shortfall against the very need that's likely to be driving those housing pressures. So where does that leave us, sir? Well, it hasn't been said yet, but there is a significant importance of adopting the plan for North Hertfordshire. And as part of the spatial strategy and the mix of allocations proposed, one of the very real benefits of that will be to begin addressing the need for affordable housing on those proposed allocations. And that's something that we fully support. In terms of the adjustment that we're looking for and how that will play out in policy, you'll be looking at an average OAN as proposed by the council of 575 DPA. And as I've just summarised, because of the continuing worsening of rates of development, that is unlikely to fully reflect the current housing situation and the increasing pressures. And my final point really to be mindful of, sir, is that the proposed approach to the housing requirement in terms of the stepped trajectory would not be achieving that 575 annualised figure on adoption of the plan. We would say that should be the case, and that in itself supports the requirement for a further uplift. But as I say, sir, to conclude, ultimately the two main points I've made are the benefits of adopting this plan and the delivery of affordable housing that it supports, notwithstanding the fact that further uplift in terms of applying the PPG for market signals, we believe is required.
Thank you. Mr. Dixon, you're indicating.
Apologies, sir. I will put my hand back down. I'm the first to do that during these sessions, so apologies.
Thank you. Mr. Aspinall.
You know, Mr. Barclay, somebody once said, statistics, dear boy, let's go round in a circle. Where do we get from statistics? Now, I think if we look at the building industry,
Mr. Aspinall, do forgive me. Whether intentionally or otherwise, you're directing your camera a little away from your face and towards your sort of eye and chest area, if I can put it like that. Thank you.
You don't like to see my chest then?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment.
All right, well, I'll try again. Somebody once said, statistics, dear boy, let's go round in a circle. And that's what I get the impression that we're doing. There's no builder in this country, no large builder, there's no small builder, and we have to support the small builder, and there's no self-builder, of which I have been, that is going to build a house or houses that are not marketable. And what we seem to be ending up with here in North Herts, there's no account taken of the increased business activity that could be attracted to the district. There's no idea about the new style of living where people are working from home and the need to get rid of the commuter line. Attracting social house dwelling. Well, you can't have social house dwelling if you don't build houses that are big or medium size, creating the profits that partly pay for the social housing because they're sold out to the associations at a knockdown price. So we've got a number of things we've got to consider. And I think myself that household growth could quite possibly in this county increase considerably, but you're not going to get the information from the data that we already have, or indeed the projections that we already have. Now, what I see is the government are saying that no cap. So the minimum houses that come through in the statistical side suddenly becomes the maximum number of houses, and nobody can build beyond that. Now, what I'm saying is that builders won't build in anywhere unless there is the demand. And it should be a little bit flexible in that respect, not going round in a circle trying to prove something that we can't prove at the end. If there's no demand, they won't build houses. If there's demand, and North Herts District Council should be looking to encourage demand, because once it encourages demand, it then gets to the stage of an increase in its revenue in every respect. And anybody who's telling me that the industry, the construction industry, is going to stagnate, that means in effect that the country is going to stagnate, because it's always been so that the industry, the construction industry, is the bedrock of making sure that we have an economy that is moving along. The money spins round. Builders spend their money in the retail places. So I I think that all this business about the statistical information needs to be dropped. And we need to look very seriously at what the government are coming out with in their new guidelines. And that's getting away from the statistics and getting down to the practical side of how we're going to build houses that are going to be affordable, social, and accommodating all those people with high-powered jobs that are going to come and live in North Hertfordshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Ms. Hamilton, I see that you're raising your physical hand. If you raise your virtual hand, that will put you into the list of people that I can see wishing to contribute. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a thing that says participants, and if you click on that, it opens up a column down the side, and at the bottom of that, with people's names on it, at the bottom of that, you'll see a raise hand icon. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Coates.
Okay, thank you. If I may address Mr. Lee, Mr. Berend, Mr. Dixon, Mr. Howell, Mr. Goodall, your contributions seem to be based on a kind of absolute sensitivity of affordability to housing supply. Where study after study has shown this to be very, very marginal. You don't have to look far. Oxford Economics, minus 1.9%. OBR, minus 1.1. OECD, minus 2.1. This is saying that a 1% increase in housing stock would be about 1% decrease in house prices. So, for example, let's say a £300,000 house, if you increase that by 240,000 homes, that would probably drop that price down to about 297,000. You're not dealing with affordability here. That's still way out of range for the people who are really bothered about affordability. I mean, there is very, very little sensitivity of affordability to housing supply. I mean, the real things which affect housing supply, as Mr. Norgan said, more things to do with mortgages, availability, not being able to use the bank of mum and dad anymore, the size of the deposit that you need now, and the other things, market rents are now much cheaper, so it's not so pressing for people to get out of the rented situation. There is another thing, the erosion of social housing. Now, this is the one sector of the housing market, I think, in which there really is a crisis. Nowhere else, just that. I'm not talking about affordable housing, I'm talking about social housing, or what used to be called council housing. That's what's needed. And that, of course, is the very sector that the developers are least interested in. So let's drop this idea that, you know, you just have to boost the supply as much as you can, and magically the prices of houses will come down. Just not true. There's studies from abroad say exactly the same thing. Geiger, Wilhelm, and Rubrecht, Germany, minus 1.4. Cheval-Woolberg, France, minus 1.5. It's worldwide phenomenon. You cannot make this cozy juxtaposition of affordability and housing supply. It doesn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Ms. Sananda.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back. I think we're getting a lot of stuff about affordability, but at the end of the day, I think it's worth thinking back to who needs a house. You need a house if we have an increasing population because you've got an increasing number of households, and that comes from the ONS data. And we need houses for those that are currently, a suppressed household, where they're sort of living together and really need to be broken out into separate households, they're overcrowded or whatever. So that's what we're looking at. So actually, if we look at the real analysis of suppressed households and the ONS, you should have an idea, I would say a pretty good idea of the number of households. It's the adding on top of that then of the market uplift that I'm struggling with, because affordability, as we're hearing, has so many factors in it. And North Herts is a commuter town. There's fashion involved. I mean, if we were talking not too far away in Harpenden, the affordability for same houses would be ridiculous because of the fashion of the houses, and the attraction to London commuters. So I think, as we're sort of hearing this, we need 20 to 30%. Actually, the truth is a house is needed by people to live in. And actually, we can work that out from the suppressed households and from the population. And what happens actually with pricing has a lot of other factors in. Things like, actually, if people can't get a good interest rate in the bank, they're using houses and renting them. So more people are in there forming a demand for houses and changing the price of houses who don't want to live in them. They just want to get rent out of someone else and get an income out of them. The house price is very confused by the problems with the interest rates. And the access to mortgages has already been mentioned. But actually, if we want to look at what's truly needed in North Herts, surely we should just be adding the suppressed households to the population requirements and seeing how that comes out. And the other comment I wanted to make is, if houses have not been built, which is the case with North Herts, we haven't been keeping up with the plan, it's unsurprising if the house prices look to be going up, because actually we haven't been increasing houses in line with the plan. That doesn't mean to say we need to add even more houses into the plan. We might need to just deliver a proportion of the houses that were in the plan in the first place. So I think, people are looking at all these signals, but we have to look at it in the round that actually when we come to housing supply, which I think is matter 22 or whatever, we won't find that we've been building the houses anyway that should have been helping the house prices.
No apologies, Mr. Nunder. Ms. Hamilton, I can see someone else on your camera there. I have to ask that you make sure that nobody else's image is shown. Thank you. It's the issue here is around data protection. Thank you. My apologies, Mr. Nunder.
That's right. And I think the last comment I want to make is this is a commuting town, and I spent 17 years of my life commuting. When I started commuting, I didn't live in North Herts, so I wouldn't have been able to afford to. I started off over in Essex ways, in a very different sort of town. We move around and we can afford to live in different areas, as time goes on. But do we try to make every area the same or not? And so I think we need to be very careful which towns we compare with affordability. And the last thing I'm going to make as a transition town is a comment that actually it's about sustainability as well when we build. It's not about just taking all our green space and building houses up and then turning an area into something that's unsustainable. That actually green belts were put there to actually make sure that the quality of life for people was actually kept within those areas. We didn't want to keep having suburban sprawls as we've had in the past. So it's all very well saying let's keep building houses if people want to come to North Hertfordshire. But actually we do need to think about where we want to build houses. If the developers want a lot of houses, then perhaps it needs a different plan, one with a new town, somewhere perhaps in North Herts or just in Hertfordshire generally, where they can create a lot of new homes. But to keep putting bubble, for a plan like this, which is about putting additions onto existing towns, we need to look at the sustainability of those towns. And I haven't heard any of the developers mention the word sustainability, how this plays into climate change. So I just want to throw that into the mix, that if they want an uplift of 20%, then actually is this plan not fit for purpose? And we need to be looking at a new town. Thanks.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. Following on from what Julia was just saying, Letchworth and North Herts is very much the point where Greenbelt was born, with Ebenezer Howard doing what he's done with regard to Letchworth Garden City and Welling Garden City and coming up with the concept which was later adopted. Let me just understand, we're taking a government ONS suggested housing figure for North Herts and adding 30% to arrive at 11,500 homes, which is an additional 2,511 homes over and above the 8,638 home starting point. I've listened to the comments of the Learned Council, and I'm sure in their representation of developers, they would happily justify any additional uplift on behalf of their clients. I'm not entirely sure whether Runnymede is entirely comparative with North Herts. Are Runnymede planning to build 85% of its new developments within the Greenbelt? Here in North Herts, the SOGB group represents hundreds, if not thousands, of people who live in this area, many of whom enjoy the benefits provided by Greenbelt, and especially during this awful pandemic. The point has already been made that building on Greenbelt is irreversible, but once the Greenbelt has gone, it has gone. This is important to the people of North Herts, and particularly the number of homes by which we intend to inflate the ONS, the government's numbers, by 2,511 homes, which is greater than the number of homes proposed by the council to be built in the so-called growth villages. The local plan is causing great stress for the people living in those growth villages and in North Herts generally. And, you know, in areas that are already identified by North Herts District Council as being significant and moderate greenbelt, you know, where the plans are quite frankly unsustainable, as Julia mentioned earlier. So please let me be clear that this simple adjustment of 30% does have a cause and effect on the people this authority represents, which I might add during the process of this local plan has moved from full overall control by the Conservatives to a coalition of Labour and Liberal. Perhaps the people have spoken and have been equally objective in their assessment. In answer to the view that in relation to the government's new white paper, which is proposed and has been mentioned here several times today, it also strengthens the protection of the Greenbelt. That's all I have to say, Inspector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Williams.
Yes, thank you very much. So it was only to give you a reference. You recall Mr. Goodall was giving you some information about rates of build, and you might wish to make a cross note to the Savills implications document attached to the hearing statement from the Crown Estates and look to figure 4.3. I don't need you to turn to it now unless you should wish to, but I think you'll find that helpful additional complementary evidence.
Grateful, thank you. Mr. Berend.
Thank you, sir. Just really two very brief points. In terms of, and this is, I'm sure, something you would already take into account of, we shouldn't be looking at delivery rates over the last year in terms of what's happened. We have been in a lockdown scenario where the house builders weren't able to get onto those sites to keep going through. So that has to be taken into account in terms of the most recent figures. So, and anyway, we should not be planning for 15, 20 years in advance on the basis of current situation that we're in. So I think, and I'm sure you're aware of that, and we'll take that into account. I think the second point is really with regard to reductions in house prices. I think one of the key points in maintaining delivery is actually maintaining that house price. It doesn't necessarily have to come down significantly, but it's about the relativity of income to house price. And actually by delivering sufficient houses that actually house prices are maintained relative to income increases actually is what part of what the government is seeking to achieve. So it's not necessarily about seeking big reductions in house prices, but making sure that actually we're not seeing that out of step with income increases. So it's just looking at it in a different way. Supply of housing is a key part of that overall package. It's not just about, it is about mortgages, it's about other elements to it, but that supply has to be an important element within that overall weaponry arsenal that the government has in looking to try and address that.
Ms. Hamilton.
Good afternoon, Inspector. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Hello. Just a couple of brief points. So I represent many people in North Hertfordshire who aren't able to buy like £300,000 houses, £200,000 houses. They do need affordable houses, but with everyone going on about this is what's needed, that's what's needed, this has got to be raised and not, people do seem to be forgetting the problem with the viability clause that Welling Hatfield saw just, I think it was the other year, where they were expecting a large number of affordable housing, and due to the viability clause, it was able to be squashed. That's one thing that has to be taken into account. I totally agree with Tom, Julia, Zed, in the fact that it does have to be sustainable. And what concerns me is we all live here. We live here, you know, we try and find jobs here. Many of us are struggling to find jobs here. You know, unemployment has continued to increase. We are still seeing businesses closing down, companies closing down. Just due to this pandemic, we've seen a number of businesses around the Stevenage area that are crumbling and struggling to keep afloat. People are losing their jobs. You know, our green belt, we've said it before, is really imperative. It was only last month that Boris Johnson confirmed the government's protection of that green belt and that it has to be protected no matter what. So that's really important. And what concerns us is, you know, this is where we live. And at the end of the day, I've worked with a lot of authorities in Hertfordshire, be it East Herts, Broxbourne, we recently worked with, and it just amazes me that it just seems to be with North Herts. I don't mean to insult anyone, but it just seems to be like them and us. And whereas other authorities are happy to, you know, speak with groups of people, speak with residents, see how they can work together to try and make a bad situation better, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be like everyone's sticking their heels in. We want to build this. We want to add on buffers. We want to double the figures. You know, what we'll do is we'll push them all through, and then maybe we'll do a review in a few years' time. And then like, oh, let's see what the trend is then. The trends are going down. The migration coming into Hertfordshire is going down. We've got Brexit. We've got all these factors. And, you know, to remove Greenbelt that offer significant contribution, to then find it's all too late and we didn't need to do that, it's too late then, isn't it, at the end of the day? And this, we know there needs to be a local plan, Inspector. We know there needs to be a local plan. We know there needs to be affordable housing. But, you know, North Herts needs to respect all of the communities and all the residents that live here already, and the people that aren't as well off to go out and buy a £300,000 and £400,000 house, that have used our green spaces over the last 9 months to just sort of keep their heads afloat and not actually go quite crazy. And so it's something that needs to be put together, and it needs to be the right plan. If that means we take a step back, like some authorities have done, and relook at the figures and say, okay, well, look, maybe we do need to reduce them, put them in line with the ONS, look at reducing some of the sites, look at removing some of the sites, and then we move on. Then everyone will be happy, not just the people that have fought this for 5 years, but North Herts will end up getting their plan, you know, and everything will be okay. That's all I've got to say. So thank you. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Okay, I think I'm getting to the stage now where I've heard all I need to hear on this particular point. I see, Mr. Norgan, you have indicated again. I'll hear from you if you can keep it brief.
Yes, I'll be very brief, actually. It's just a point about lack of evidence which has come up. I've been listening to these builders and developers, and it seems as though what they are effectively saying is if houses become unaffordable, that the thing to do is to build more of them. That's where we get the uplift from. But they don't seem to have provided any evidence that building more houses will actually bring the price down. None of them have done that. They haven't quoted any papers to that effect. So it seems as though the logic of their argument is not supported. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hear any final points from Mr. Lee on this question, and then move on to issue 21.2. So, Mr. Lee.
I'm conscious that we've tended to cover a lot of ground that we've already talked about, so I don't really want to repeat what I've already said. I think that there are a couple of points that are worth picking up on, and evidently a number of people have referred to the fact that building more houses isn't going to make them cheaper, and various studies quoted to that effect. Mr. Berendt has noted that housing supply is one of the mechanisms that the government sees as the way in which to address the current situation. And we are constrained by planning practice guidance. As you know, we are bound to follow what is said there. And it is clear in the planning practice guidance that we have to consider market signals, and where those market signals suggest that there is a need to increase or to increase beyond the household projections, that we do that. So yes, we are deferring to what we are told that we have to do within the practice guidance. And in many ways, it's not for anyone here to be justifying that, because that's what the government's told us to do. However, the uplift is relative to the household projections. It's what uplift should be applied to the household projections, not to the household projections and the adjustments that have already been made. And therefore, as we point out in paragraph 41 of our document, we are working with a figure that is 33% higher than the household projections. And we consider that that is a justified position, but there is no need to go any further than that in terms of the numbers. And in terms of the government position or the position within the existing plan, we are in a position whereby this number is lower than the number that was in the original plan, or that informed the original plan. There has been a reduction. It's just that we have taken account of all of the factors that we need to take account of. We've taken account of the housing supply, and we've gone and used the longer term migration trends to help mitigate that. We have looked at the information that we have, and in the round, we believe that we have got an objectively assessed need that is justified based upon the information that's in front of us. And obviously that's something that you will need to consider in the light of the evidence that you've heard. But I think that clearly that has to be done independently of any constraint, be that constraint from the industry to be able to deliver that number, or be it constraint because of designations of land within the Greenbelt at the moment. I mean, if there are arguments about constraint, then clearly they can be considered as part of the housing requirement, but they do need to be set aside in terms of establishing the objectively assessed need.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lee. I see, Mr. Coates, you're indicating, but I did say that I wasn't going to hear any further points on this. Is it something very, very brief indeed? I can neither hear you nor see you, Mr. Coates.
This will take 20 seconds, Mr. Barclay. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You could, in theory, couldn't you, to comply with what the PBG says, you could put an uplift on market signals of, say, 1% or 0.1% even. That would still be fulfilling the letter of the law here, wouldn't it? I think we've given you the arguments. You could argue that way for market signals if you wanted. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coates. I'm now going to take an adjournment for 20 minutes. So I'll make it nearly 3:15. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:35. And if you could, I know I've got it right this time, please just turn your cameras and microphones off. Thank you. Okay, it is now 3:35, and so I resume the hearing. What I think I'm going to do is take issues 21.2 and 21.3 together, because I think that makes some logical sense. So if I look to the council in the first instance, would that mean the baton being handed on to you, Mr. Smith?
Yes, it would, sir. Thank you. Yes, we take them both together. As you'll see in our response to you in ED 191A, we consider that, yes, these latest figures do represent a meaningful change. As we've said, there's a drop of 17% against the figures you previously examined. And as a consequence of that, moving very quickly on to 21.3, the council's proposed response is that the housing requirement for NHDC is reduced to 11,600 homes.
Yeah, and that's slightly different from the OAN. What's the difference there, Mr. Smith?
That's correct. There's a small uplift of 100 homes. Again, as we've put in ED 191A, you may recall when we had the original hearings, we had an OAN of 13,800 that we uplifted to 14,000. And our explanation for that was primarily around the advice in PPG, planning practice guidance, around homes for older people and ensuring opportunities for older people to live in their homes as long as possible, effectively. And we went through in those sessions that population and household projections have an allowance for what's called the institutional population. So that's people living in sort of care homes and other forms of that style of accommodation. And the statistical convention is that the proportion of people requiring that type of accommodation remains stable, whereas we said as a matter of judgment, rather than putting all of that requirement into a care home requirement, which is a separate part of the housing policy, we said we'd split that, and we'd put, as a matter of judgment, a small proportion of that added onto the OAN as part of our housing requirement, and the rest we would meet as bed spaces in use class C2, so care home style accommodation. And we followed the same principle here, but similarly to the fact that the OAN figure has come down, the institutional population has also come down in these latest figures. So rather than an uplift of 200, we now propose an uplift of 100. And that tallies with the requirements in the plan for care homes.
Okay, is that to say that homes for older people then aren't captured within the OAN?
They are captured in the OAN, obviously, in terms of older members of the population who require, mainstream housing. They're obviously captured in the household formation rates that Mr. Lee talked about, but in the original SHMA, requirements for C2 uses are talked about separately, and the advice in the original SHMA that, again, we went through at the original examination session was that effectively the council should consider how he wants to treat that C2 institutional population.
Okay, but the general principle here then is that the requirement reflects the OAN, but with a small addition.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, which is reasonably straightforward. Who wants to speak on this? Mr. Berendt.
Thank you, sir. Sorry for putting on my video or not. It slows my system down if I have it on all the time. I think with regard to whether there's been a meaningful change in the situation, which is the question obviously asked in 21.3 and taking these together, I think in relation to the 2018 population projections and household projections, I wouldn't deny that there has been a reduction in those on the basis of that. I think what my concerns really are is actually responding to 2018 based projections into a 2014 into the 2012 MPPF and the framework there. We're in a plan that comes through a transition period, and as part of that transition period, the government were looking to get through, ensure plans were coming through quickly on the basis of the evidence as submitted, and that was a clear aim in terms of that transition period from the 2012 MPPF into the 2019 MPPF. What we're looking here is a plan that now has gone through consideration of the 2016 household projections and now the 2018 household projections. But it's a very difficult position. I think the council have looked at in terms of suppression, which I think is an important element of that, and that element to the reconsideration of the 2018. But I do think it's necessary to remember that when considering looking back at things like the things we've discussed earlier today in terms of affordability uplifts and those elements, and the government's wider response of looking to deliver 300,000 homes a year, and the fact that that hasn't changed within the wider position that the council are facing itself. It's facing in terms of its housing situation. So I do think it's very difficult.
Forgive me, Mr. Brown. Are you suggesting that I shouldn't have asked the council to consider the 2018 projections, and are you also suggesting that I shouldn't have asked them whether there'd been a meaningful change?
I think you should be asking to see whether there's been a meaningful change, but I think you can also consider the situation with regard to when the plan was submitted and the government's desire to see 300,000 homes coming forward, and how that and their continued support for the 2014 based household projections with regard to the standard method. I think that is an important consideration to take forward within the whole of the meaningful change in the housing situation being faced by North Hertfordshire. So I think that is a consideration that you need to take on board. I think in terms of if you were thinking of,
has, as you say, a 300,000 home aspiration, and it is also the government, is it not, that sets up the policy framework for delivering its aspirations, and it's my job to apply that framework.
It is, sir. It is, sir. I'm just saying, in terms of the considerations of the government's wider position and elements that you need to consider, sir, as part of that. I think you have to consider that the 2018 projections on the basis of the 2012 MPPF, but you also in terms of where the plan is and what needs to be delivered on a wider basis. But that's just a concern I think we and our members have with regard to how this is being applied in terms of transitionary plans and the length of time to which we're applying these 28 projections to a framework that is considerably out of date now, sir. But I understand where you're coming from. I understand the position you're in, but I just wanted to raise those points, sir. Thank you.
You'll be heartened to know that there aren't so many transitional plans, as we call them, left in the system.
I seem to be dealing with most of them, sir, in terms of my my patch. Thank you, sir.
That's good fortune on your part, Mr. Byrne. Thank you very much. Mr. Griffiths.
Thank you, sir. I am pleased to note that we have a point on which we agree with the council, in that we do agree that there is a meaningful change. But I think our view of that change is somewhat different, because I think, as we said earlier, we would look to the 2018 base principal projection as being the basis for the calculation of the housing requirement.
If you'll forgive me, Mr. Griffiths. yeah, I know that a lot of people will want to say that on the basis of their view in relation to the OAN. I don't really want to do that. I don't want to go back over all the OAN stuff as
I'm not
well.
going to go any further, so I'll just say that the gap is far wider as far as we're concerned than the 11% reduction that is set out by the council. So
an even more meaningful change, you would say.
Yeah, that's right. If we agree then that there's been a meaningful change, then in our view, I think that change is far greater. I think the local plan requirements certainly should be reduced. If you agree that it should be further than is suggested by the council, then certainly that suggests to me that there should be a set of main modifications, and that they focus on the removal of the sites which makes a significant contribution to the Greenbelt. And I think you'll be hearing more about this when we come on to Matter 23 next week. But certainly I would quote the proposed sites GA1 and GA2 at Great Ashby, northeast of Stevenage, KB Fort Nebber. We'll come on to that next week. It's interesting because this very evening, when in Hatfield Council in full is meeting to consider the final OAN for their local plan, which is also being examined under the 2012 NPPF. So anybody that's got any time this evening, just key into the council meeting and see what they have to say, because I think that there are very similar issues there. But what Welwyn Hatfield are doing as a local authority, they're going to put to the inspector a series of what they think should be changes to the plan of main modifications. And the ones that they want excluded from the plan are those which in the Greenbelt study make harm or high harm to the Greenbelt. So I think that's where we want to go here in North Hertfordshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths. Yeah, okay. Mr. Nanda.
Okay, I wanted to raise a question firstly, which is if the population have changed in a significant way, and I think we all agree it has, but clearly we don't agree on what the number is. The population is also a factor that feeds into the required retail space and employment space. So does that need to be amended or considered in the local plan? So I just want to throw that in as a question, because the population is a driver for those, and it's not suppressed housing need, it's pure population, which the ONS is coming down.
Yes, I understand the point, but I'm certainly not going to focus on that one today. I already have enough in today's basket.
So right. The other thing I wanted, I suppose, to reflect on is that, you know, these hearings got suspended because we had to await an extraordinary meeting of the council. And having sat through, I don't know if you sat through that meeting, but a number of, I imagine a lot of us did, much of it was in closed session, so we couldn't see it. But my sense was that the councillors weren't really sure whether the local plan could be amended for the 2018 data, and in fact didn't really discuss didn't have a robust discussion about what the housing need should be. It was more of a discussion about whether they could or couldn't alter the local plan at this stage. So I just felt some clarity. You know, there's obviously, it's not just, clearly you've asked the question. So my understanding is that you can amend the local plan, even if it's quite impactful for the 2018 data. But it appeared that the councillors didn't share that view. And I think there's now, you know, because of the transitional state of this plan, it's now in quite a, you know, it's from a public's perspective, it's quite frustrating to sort of tune in to watch your council discuss what you think is going to be what is the real need in this town, to see a more discussion about what you can do with the local plan. I don't know if you can add anything to that, but it would be very helpful.
I can only be so helpful on this point, but you know, what may or may not be in the mind of councillors or what they knew or didn't know when they were having these discussions is not a matter for me. That's a matter for the council's democratic processes, and not something that I would comment on. The council can't change its plan. Changes to the plan can only be brought about by my recommendations. The council can, however, put to me any main modifications to the plan that it thinks are necessary to make the plan as submitted a sound plan. So where it thinks now that there are soundness problems. So that's the procedure, if you like.
That's helpful. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stocker.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. Just to introduce myself, CBRE act as the planning consultant for and speak on behalf of Ash Hill and its land interest at CD5. We support the council in its ambitions to bring forward the current local plan, but I would just like to bring a couple of points to your attention to help your consideration on whether the changes we've been discussing are meaningful. These are in relation to some recent local plan adoptions and High Court decisions, which are pertinent to whether the changes we've been discussing mean that the local housing plan requirement must be modified. I'd like to make these comments just particularly in light of...
Ms. Stocker, do forgive me. You're talking admirably quickly. No, that's fine. But I'm having just a little trouble with the sound quality for some reason. So perhaps if you were to slow up or make some sort of adjustment there.
Yeah, of course. I don't know if that's any better. Might be a slightly dodgy set of headphones.
It's not much better, but if you speak more slowly, then I might be able to cope.
Okay, please do stop me if it's inaudible, and I'll try something different. Just what I was saying is that if possible, I'd like to just raise a couple of points in relation to helping your discussion as to whether you consider the changes that have been discussed today as meaningful. I'm raising these particularly in light of the comments just raised by Mr. Goodall earlier in terms of the need for the local plan to be adopted for North Herts and where we currently are in the examination process. So there was a High Court decision in July this year, which was related to Buckinghamshire District Council. A legal challenge was raised as to whether there was an error in judgment in finding the plan sound based upon the fact that the 2016 ONS projections hadn't been considered. So those 2016 projections for Buckinghamshire estimated around a 42% reduction in household formation. Buckinghamshire didn't consider that as a meaningful change, and that position was held by the inspector basically on the fact, or having regards to the fact, that those projections only form the start of assessing your housing need, and also the importance to the national priority of boosting the land for housing supply. The inspector in that case concluded that it would be unjustified to delay the adoption of the plan in light of those projections, and that position was sustained by High Court this year in July 2020. I think this is relevant just in this case in terms of if this change needs more evidence to be prepared to support it, that there are disadvantages in further delaying the local plan. Not least that the district can't currently demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. There's a chronic lack of delivery in the district. I think based upon the most recent housing delivery test, only about 44% of need has been met over the past 3 years, which puts the council in presumption of sustainable development, and also I think performs in the bottom 10 authorities across England. So I just wanted to put those factors forward in terms of consideration today and balancing the items we've been discussing as to whether that housing target needs adjustment and whether the change is considered meaningful. We also have some site-specific considerations that we set out in our hearing statement that I'm sure some people are aware of. Just also to bring your attention back to the local plan in Runnymede, I think that had a reduction in number of households of around 5,000 as a result of the 2018 projections. And the inspector considered that that was an item to be reviewed through a local plan review, so to not delay adoption to that plan. And that plan was submitted for EIP in July 2018, so I think around a year after this one, and has similar considerations to what we've been discussing today. So I just wanted to put these to you for consideration, after the hearings, for you to take away in terms of whether that change is meaningful and the housing requirement needs to be updated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dorman.
That's better. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Sorry. Very, very briefly, I just wanted to add my support to Mr. Griffiths. Yes, there has been a meaningful change in North Hertfordshire for the figures that ORS has calculated, but I feel that they really should be much, much lower, as we've been indicating, and that would most certainly represent a meaningful change. And secondly, the housing modification or the housing requirement as a result should be significantly modified downwards to cater for the lower housing numbers that I think are relevant. In particular, again, Mr. Griffiths hit on this, I believe that all the greenbelt sites, certainly those of significance, should be removed, and the lowing housing requirement, I think, could be met, and with spare capacity still remaining, if that was the case, resulting from a lower OAM. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. So, Mr. Smith, I think this is probably for you. So, a number of people say, well, the OAN should be different, lower, and therefore the requirement should also be lower. And other people are saying, well, if I think that the plan still need not be delayed, I think that's what I'm hearing. What's your view on that point? If I disagreed with the council about the OAN, you might not be able to answer this at this stage, and I fully appreciate that. But if I did consider that the OAN needed to be lower for whatever reason, would it be right that the requirement and therefore the supply should also be altered?
Yes, I think it would. In fairness, I probably should have said at the outset that, yes, obviously the answers I gave are predicated on you finding both the OAN that we've presented today and the sites that we will present on subsequent days being sound. That's the position we have to take clearly. And as you say, if you decide the change in the OAN should be more meaningful or less meaningful, or if you decide that some of the sites you're subsequently going to hear about should perhaps come out, then we may have to revisit our position. Obviously, you'll be aware that when we did the papers to you at the start of this year, we were saying potentially you should consider adjusting the requirement to reflect the available supply to make sure we had a 5-year supply. So yeah, I think it's a wait and see point, isn't it, sir, to where you are at the end of these few weeks. And if you are minded to change one or more of the factors that we discussed, then I think the council would just have to consider its position depending on how far you are minded to change it. Obviously, a small adjustment is easier to accommodate than a big one.
Yeah, understood. Ms. Cottier.
Yeah. Yeah, but about the question where we're talking about whether it represents a meaningful change. And I wanted to initially, when I began to look at this question, look at what does the word meaningful actually mean in planning terms. And so I tried to look it up in the definitions of the various legal guidance we're getting, and I found that it said there is no clear definition of the word meaningful. So that led me to think, well, it must simply just mean what it means in the dictionary, which is it's full of meaning, it means something to someone somewhere. And clearly that's that depends on who you're asking. For example, if you're asking us, is it a meaningful change? We're going to translate that into, well, that will mean perhaps we will be able to save some of the sites that we don't want to lose. And that's very meaningful from the point of view of the people in the community who have been spending years of their lives trying to protect their various sites. However, if you ask the same question to the council, that would translate to what does it mean for the council financially? Because from the point of view of the economic side of the economics have been factored in as well, and that's a motivating factor from behind the scenes, as well as these numbers, which so far we really can't agree anything on them other than that it's not an exact science. So it's a bit of a vague question, but in terms of is it full of meaning? Well, yes, it is, from the point of view of any amount of site that we can save is meaningful, even more so now because more people have been using these green spaces during this awful era that we're living through. And it's taken on a whole new meaning, perhaps a greater meaning than it did have before, because no longer are we able to, I know, and hopefully this won't be going on for too much longer, but it's been a place where people can go outside of their houses freely when all the other places have been closed. And I think that's made people appreciate it more than ever. So it's perhaps become even more meaningful than ever before that this green space is available. And perhaps we've reevaluated things such as what does money mean to us when, you know, other things have become miserable. You know, there's people who have lost loved ones, or there are people who are sitting locked up in their little homes working from their desks where they used to go and commute to the office and drop off and get Starbucks on the way. Everything's changed. So I think we need to reevaluate. Could we perhaps, all of us agree, what does the word meaningful actually mean? Because we're talking about it, and we're talking about it in relation to something we've agreed isn't an exact science. And I'm kind of like, oh, we're a ship and we're steering off true north, and then we've gone off a little bit, but are we going to bring it back to true north with the historic data at least? I know that was the last question, but we seem to be sort of steering off course and then compounding that deviation from true north with our neglect of historic data. And now we're talking about a word we can't actually find defined in planning terms. Sure.
If I can help you there,
yes,
yes. Perhaps. Yeah, I've asked, the reason I've written the question the way I have is because I've lifted the phrase meaningful change directly out of the planning practice guidance. So that's why I've asked the question. And just, I suppose I would comment that looking it up in the dictionary, in the absence of any specific definition in the planning practice guidance, is a good start. It is something that judges do from time to time.
I did that, yeah, and I did do that, but I was just interested to see if there was an actual definition in the planning guidance, but I couldn't find one.
There isn't.
No.
Sorry, did I cut you off there? I didn't mean to.
No, I think it had run its natural course. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rigg.
Thank you. What the council has proposed isn't a meaningful change, but the questions I have relate as to whether it's adequate, and that's been discussed elsewhere. But the actual figure they've come out at, I believe, is driven more by their ability to build within the time frame and the constraints imposed by the 5-year land bank criteria than a conviction that the 11,600 number is the right number. And therefore I just wonder how much conviction they have in that number itself. It's more convenient, I think, rather than the right number. But
okay, thank you, Mr. Rigg. Mr. Griffiths.
Yes, so just hopefully I can help in that from all the cases I've read recently, it would appear to me, in my experience, that meaningful is down to planning judgment. And the planning judgment, sir, is yours. I don't know whether Ms. Ormsby would agree with me on that.
I suspect she might.
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you for that. Is anyone else wanting to say anything else on issues 21.2 and 21.3? That's the meaningful change in North Hertfordshire. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Inspector. Just really to add that there has been a change and that is noted. But in terms of whether it's meaningful, whether there's enough homes that have been removed, from our perspective, as previously stated, we would like to see a further reduction in line with the numbers that have been bandied around during the course of today. So, you know, we are appreciative for North Herts District Council recognising the need to reduce, and we definitely want them to have a plan. But we would ask them just to reconsider again the impact on the Greenbelt, which is quite a significant and historical factor to the North Herts area. So that's what we'd like to say. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rigg, you have your hand up. Is that a legacy hand? Have you just simply forgotten to put it down?
my apologies, legacy hand.
Thank you, and for you as well, the same for you, Mr. Hawkins. Okay, very good, thank you. Is there then anything else on issues 21.2 and 21.3? Okay. I have to say I'm slightly in two minds about whether to go on to 21.4 or whether to bundle all of the remaining issues for tomorrow morning. Well, my preference, I think, is to leave things where they are today and to pick up in the morning on the 21.4, 5 and 6, and those are very similar questions, but specifically in relation to Luton. Does that cause any problems in terms of attendance from the council's side or from Luton's?
So not from ours, and I think that we would support that. It seems that's an appropriate point at which to draw a line. I think the debate on Luton is going to take some time, so a fresh start tomorrow would be advisable, I suggest.
Yeah, okay. That's my preference as well, I think. So on that basis, I will close for today. I make it 9 minutes past 4. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume on Zoom tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.